Welcome to episode 92, Host Reflection of Silver Lining for Learning. We have done three amazing episodes, starting with the group of people from University of Colorado, Boulder, and Denver, talking about not learning loss, but learning gains, called Sky is the Limit. We had another episode having two people from Microsoft who have really come up with a great nonprofit to promote computer science education in schools, in high schools. That's amazing. Individuals making tremendous impact. And then we had another episode with led by Fernando and our friends from India and Uruguay about innovations during the pandemic around the globe, which give us some really interesting lessons to think about. And the big one is how not to go back and how do we promote the promotions. So I was wondering if any one of you, Chris, Punya, and Kurt, you want to jump in to share with us, any thoughts you had over the three episodes and anything else you want to talk about.
Well, I think all of them indicate anyone watching the show has a chance to make a difference because each of these were highly successful and impactful and yet doable. So someone might document what's going on, as Fernando did and his colleagues last week, and 75 odd stories of change during the pandemic that UNESCO picked up and published. I find that to be the type of thing that people should be doing in our field, that should be finding out. And it aligns, last week, it exactly aligns with our mission. It took us 91 episodes to get there. We finally got one that perfectly aligns. So kudos to Chris for bringing, and Young for bringing folks in for last week. That was great. But, it's not just documentation, what's going on. It's also getting involved in developing new programs and finding ways to make them sustainable and replicable. So the Teal program in particular comes to mind. And we were dealing we were talking to the folks the week before in Colorado, as you said, who are dealing with citizen education and action-based research, inquiry learning for high school students throughout Colorado. And that has been replicated in other places as well. And they have colleagues at Berkeley and other locations. So I think all three are something an individual can do, but it didn't have to be localized. All three were disseminated in a national audience or a global audience. And I think that is important to highlight. And someone who's going to go back and use these weeks within their classes, that's something that could link these three programs together. And then they might search for other programs that have the same themes or the same impact. That could be a student assignment, I guess. Look for other episodes that we've run that are similar in nature, and maybe write to the people who are involved in them and interview them. So that's what I'll say for this.
Punya?
Yeah, so I was thinking of another phenomena that swept the globe over the past three episodes, or a little bit longer than that maybe, and that's this little game called Wordle. I don't know if you've gotten hooked onto it or not, but I am. That is literally the first thing I do lying in bed when I wake up in the morning. I don't share but it's become a thing. Now, the thing that's so cool about that is at some level, the game is not very complicated. Games like this have been around forever, right? But there were certain elements in the design of that game, like the way it was structured, the way the gameplay was structured, that was like very simple and easy to use. It was a simple idea implemented well, but it also did two things. One, it made sharing, like everybody's playing the same game once a day. It's the same word for everybody in the world, which I think is like such a cool idea. But it also, so most digital things, we make the thing of like, oh, you can have multiple copies of this, while Wordle was, you can play it once a day, then you have to wait 24 hours. So it made that experience valuable by actually reducing access to it by design. So I was thinking about that, so in some ways, some of the episodes that we have had, like, are there ideas in there which can also, so so the elements that we can take away is that simplicity of design, but ease of sharing, so that people can learn about it, then be a part of it in some way. And I think that that may be one way of thinking about how some of these ideas that are emerging can be sustainable. Because I think so as I'm thinking of Wordle, and I'm thinking, oh, that's really cool that a game which is about words and can become so popular. At the same time, I'm also looking at the broader political climate and sort of social climate within which education is functioning. And there I feel much less. So here, we are arguing about open systems. We are arguing about discussing the possibility of anybody learning anywhere, anytime, because of these resources that are available, whether it's the episode from the kids from Nepal and so on. At the other end, we are having books being banned. We are having, there's a bill in the Iowa legislature saying that there need to be cameras in every classroom. The governor in Virginia has an email address where you can report if you think anything weird is happening. I mean, so we have these tensions between this openness, between innovation, between good, simple design, while there are forces which are sort of trying to close it down even more, constrain the conversation, constrain the kinds of moves that educators can make. So I don't know, whether I have a question here or a comment, but I just find that really interesting, or worrying at some level as well, about these sort of these forces. And this came up in the last episode, right? Where how much of this push towards go back to what it was before, or maybe even more regressive than before. That's another movement there, which I don't think we can ignore as a part of our conversations.
Punya, spell Wordle for the audience here, because Wordle used to be a word cloud tool that no longer exists, the one that I use. So yes. People might get confused. How do you spell it?
I think it's Wordle. And the story behind it is fascinating. This is this one man who did it as a gift for his girlfriend. And it just went viral. And it's a beautiful little game. And you play it once a day for a few minutes and you're done. But there have been some really nice, interesting sort of UX designers who have looked at sort of the design of the game and as to what makes it so playable. And it is deceptively simple. Let me just put it that way.
All right. Thank you, Punya. Chris?
So I'll build on what Punya is talking about, because every spring I teach a course called Motivation and Learning. And it's not about games, but we play games as part of the course, because games are excellent specific examples of engineered motivation. And then we look at how the games do it and we say, well, could you do this in academic learning, and what would it take? And in choosing the games, this is a course I've taught for more than a decade, but in choosing the games last year, I really thought about the pandemic. And we played a game called Among Us, which is a variant on a game that's been around a long time called Mafia, where of the players, one of them is a killer and steadily picks off the other players. And you have to figure out who it is before they get everybody. And of course, that game has been very popular, and it's very popular because there is an invisible killer right now in society. And this is a kind of a way of externalizing that and trying to deal with it through fantasy. We played a game called GRIS, G-R-I-S, which is Spanish for grief, that actually doesn't look like a game. It's kind of stretching my limits to call it a game, but it's about working through the 5 stages of grief. And again, a lot of the students really related to it. So what does this have to do with what we were just talking about? I think that people are scared, including me. They're really scared by what's going on in the world now, financially, politically, ecologically, in terms of health. And you can kind of go in opposite directions if you're scared. And we see this throughout history. One direction that you can go in is towards a very conservative, very top-down, trust the leader and just do what the leader says, where you don't have to be scared anymore because you just need to follow orders and not think about what's happening. And we see a lot of that across the world these days, as we've been discussing. The other direction to go is to form communities in which people share being scared and support one another and face the fear as opposed to running away from the fear. And unfortunately, I think that education is much more an example of the running away than it is the forming communities and facing. And, on the one hand, I get all these articles. I subscribe to these services that are free that just summarize lots and lots of articles. And so every morning I get this list of stuff to read. And I can't tell you how many articles say that students need social emotional support without offering anything at all to do anything about it. They're just stating it as something that needs to happen. And then the very next articles talk about all the ways that we're undercutting students in terms of their social emotional support. So I think that part of what's good about Silver Lining for Learning is that the kinds of people that we invite on and the kinds of models that we promote are models that are contextual. They're not ignoring what's happening in the world, but they're based on kind of facing it, building community, sharing, promoting respect and diversity, instead of running in the opposite direction.
So Chris, I want to build on what you said.
Can I add one thing?
Go ahead. Please.
Sorry. I think, Chris, you identified two very critical things. One is this fear and this urge to go back kind of a thing, regress or head in the sand. And the other is this opportunity to the community. I think there's another thing that's going on. And there was an article in the Chronicle speaking about faculty members in general, but I think that's true across the board. So they talked about this, it's like we are talking a lot about the Great Resignation, a lot of people who are rethinking life goals. And to me, that's actually an educational opportunity, right? But they also spoke about what they're calling the Great Disengagement, where people, when you think about the communities and the organizations that we are a part of, that what these last 2 years have done is sort of get us disengaged. So we will do the minimum that we need to do so that, I get the paycheck and I get food on the table. But this broader communitarian instinct, which I think undergirds education very, very fundamentally, because clearly people are not getting in there for the paychecks, right? That's not the prime motivator. A prime motivator was this thing of engagement, of working for the betterment of kids and so on. I think that's become harder to convince ourselves of, as much in higher ed, as much as in K-12. So I think there's a third element there. So there's the fear, there is the positive that we try to highlight in our show, but there is also the sense of disengagement. And I think our show does a little bit of addressing the latter as well, but there is that component, I think, which is important for us to address.
And that's where Kurt started. That's where Kurt started to say, we're seeing things where individuals can make a big difference. You don't have to say to yourself, I'm helpless, I'm powerless, I'm just a single person, there's nothing I can do.
So that's actually the one I want to follow up on. Is that Chris, when you were mentioning about, we always say we need to provide opportunities for children to be socially, emotionally engaged. Adults always want to say children need this. We always say as if they were helpless, as if they were just there to receive. This is not new, but you look at the 3 episodes, in essence, they created tiny opportunities and students flourished. You think about the Colorado group, right? It was really tiny. They were not even in the school. They were just providing opportunities for children to take leadership. Then you have Kevin Wang's group. They just provided, support for offering computer science. Then think about our friend from India talking about how these nonprofit groups, community groups, were offering something the schools could not offer. Then you heard Fernando talk about how when systems collapse, then other players can have a role. In many ways, I think we need to really treat our children, our students as really capable, a lot more capable than we ascribe them. I kept thinking about, I'm not talking about the wealth, I'm talking about the poor children who have been stereotyped as people who really know nothing. We tell, oh yeah, poor kids, their teachers don't have low expectations of them, therefore they cannot. We have a discourse that drives our students really into a sense of learned helplessness. That's something. I think, the 3 episodes really said, if you created tiny opportunities, which may not serve everybody, but it serves somebody. I think in edge of all our episodes, in silver lining, is about different people creating different possibilities of opportunities. Recently I've been exploring the idea about opportunity. Opportunities don't exist. The possibilities of opportunities exist. Because opportunities, when a person sees something and does something with that becomes opportunity. You need the individual to do that. And everything adults said, we create the curriculum as opportunities, schools as opportunities. They're possibilities, but they really don't apply to every individual who may have the strength, who may have the passion to do that. So I was really impressed with the 3 episodes. They're creating the possibilities of opportunity for some children, not entirely everybody, but for some. So I was hoping that, we can focus on that. In the social emotional learning, I've explored a lot. I think a lot of times they're basically become authoritarian again, become standards again. They're driving teachers, driving students to behave the same way, to do the same thing. They have assessment. It is another kind of authoritarian type of education. It's not really. So it's how we can create opportunities or possibilities of opportunities for children. Anybody can jump in.
Yeah, all 3 in some way involved something serendipitous, that something magical happened in each one of those situations. And that piece, the magical piece, might not be replicated. My point is that often you have to do projects and things arrive at the right time for it to flourish. And that happened with the Microsoft exec saying, hey, we will fund you. You just have to have the idea first, walk around and talk about it, maybe even start to walk away. And then all of a sudden someone comes. So you have to be willing to deal with a little bit of ambiguity and just talk to others that are in your environment about your ideas that you have. I mean, the Colorado project is called Youth Participatory Action Research, YPAR. That got highlighted because of the pandemic. The students probably were going to do wonderful things with that project anyways, but parents started to notice it. Other teachers started to notice it. School districts started to notice it because it fit the time. It just, and the same with Fernando's work, it fit the times. You have to have the idea, you have to have the initiative, you have to believe in yourself, you have to have the self-efficacy to carry it forward when the challenges come your way, and there'll be many. But there are these moments in running any project where you have some angelic force coming that shows up at the right moment, and that piece can't be replicated. The other pieces can be, but and I'm just curious what you think about, because they did all have, and we all have this experience when you're doing something and all of a sudden, there's a grant available for that. If you find the right person, the right place, hey, you should be applying to the Spencer or whomever, So you can't do these projects alone, I guess is the point. You gotta be.
Kurt, I just want to jump in to say something. I think when you said this episode should, everybody can do something. I completely agree. But I think we also run into people who said, I'm trying to be innovative, but I don't get the support. I'm not in the position. I think we need to change that mindset. Is to say, start from where you are. Start with what you have instead of trying to aspire to say, oh, I want to get $5 million from, this and that.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the wrong attitude, for a lot of people. Many people say, oh, I wish I could get into that position so I can do this.
Right.
I've never, I don't think that's a good approach, right? Everybody can do something.
So these people all started with what they can do.
Right.
Exactly.
And the same is true from the Nepal one. They were doing the English training through MOOCs before the pandemic, and then using those exploded because the kids were ready for it.
Yes, exactly. Do what you can. Start with what you have. Do
Right.
not just start with wishing what you could have. I think this is a big part about innovation and entrepreneur thinking is that everybody has opportunities, but can you see that? No matter where you are, how hard it is, I really believe that. But do you start with that, or do you start wishing that if someone could give me this, what would I do? I don't think that's the right approach.
So, I think one of the things that was common to the episode on learning losses, the Colorado one and the Microsoft one, which sort of stood out to me, is sort of, Zhao, what you're saying. Yes, but on top of that, they took advantage of existing systems and wiggle room within the system. So, for instance, in the Microsoft one, they worked with the teachers, right? So that they wouldn't come and say, we have the answer. It's like, no, we have to collaboratively figure out the answer, right? That the person who knows computer science, who's an engineer somewhere, can devote so many hours to it that they work with the teachers to co-teach that together. I think that's another aspect of it, which is, you have the idea, you work with whatever resource you have, but you also try to take advantage of existing systems and find the wiggle room in that system. Every system has some wiggle room, and you can figure that out. And I think in the third episode, the example, for instance, from India of using the WhatsApp group, those NGOs were already on the ground. They had those relationships, and then you leverage those relationships. I think that's the other sort of element to it, which is you don't have an all or nothing attitude. It's either my way or the highway. You're saying, okay, what's the wiggle room here that we can do something new and different, and let that flourish, because that's now deeply, and I think what somebody mentioned, I think Chris, you mentioned that, or Zhao mentioned that, then it is deeply contextual, right? And then it can actually take roots. Otherwise, it becomes this external thing that comes in and gets spat out by the system, because the system is way stronger than any little innovation that you bring in at a small scale.
In the Pune, I was reading somewhere, I think Richard Feynman, I think Chris was Richard Feynman at Caltech. Anyway, he was talking about life as filled with randomness. A lot of you have been exploring about randomness. But some people say more positive things in randomness. Some people say negative things in randomness. So that's where life, I think, is. That is where innovation flourishes, is that, the same randomness, the same car accident can have two different results. I truly had really two friends in Beijing. One had a leg of lamb delivered to him for Chinese New Year. Another one had a fight on the road. So it's the same accident. Not the same accident. So it depends on how you approach this thing. So because today, I think you're absolutely right. We look at the individuals and how the individuals, like you said, contextualize the opportunities in that. I think this is, when we do silver lining, part of our job is really to encourage more entrepreneurs to say, if you have an idea, go do it and try it and drive that, And I think seeing every system, no matter how hard, how rigid the system is, there are space where you can do something. Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to take it in a little different direction and talk about the role of the media in these three dimensions that we've been discussing. I've long struggled with the media and ed tech, and I'm sure that you've experienced this as well. If a reporter calls me, they either want to hear that a technology is magic, or they want to hear that it's bullshit. And in fact, the whole hype cycle is just an oscillation between those two things. A new device comes along, the vendors want to sell it, they promote it as magic, the media buys in, all that they want to hear is about how this is the solution to everything. And then, of course, when it isn't the solution to anything, they take great glee in saying, well, this was bullshit, people were tricked, ed tech is worthless, blah, blah, blah. And then we go around the hype cycle again. So I've become very wary of the media. And what I've learned is that when they call me up and say, well, you know, does this particular ed tech work? What I say is it depends. And that gets them off the phone in about 10 seconds because they realize that I'm not going to play their game. And they can't sell a story that's true that says it depends. If you use it well, it's going to work. If you don't use it well, it's going to be a waste of time and money. So nothing new about that. But I think now the media at this time of fear is really throwing gasoline on the fires of fear, because no matter what the innovation is, they always focus on the negative part of it. Online learning. Here's some poor kid who was taught poorly online, hated every second of it, and so online learning sucks. Families contributing to education. Well, here's some poor family. Parents are both working 2 jobs. The kids are, you know, kind of abandoned at home. They're not getting any of the social services that being in school would have provided. And so this whole business of remote learning is a disaster. Just send them to school and hope they don't get COVID and die. And so on and so on and so on. It's no wonder that people are terrified, because the media does the opposite of what we do. We find something that's not magic, but it is working for some people. And if it's scalable, we point that out, and we point out the conditions for success, and we talk about the opportunities to take it somewhere. Could we look across the world and find examples of the same concept that are failing because they're done badly? Absolutely. But that's what the media is doing. And I just think they're not accepting any responsibility for the fact that when people are afraid, what sells is fear and despair. And so they're going to just pile on in terms of that. And
Chris,
I
agree with you, but I would not just isolate the media. I think government policymakers do the same thing. So they want the magic bullet. You know, many years ago, under George Bush, we have the What Works clearinghouse. And it doesn't work. Nothing works across. It's just a stupid dream. And today, you know, in the government, it's just produced another report of COVID learning from the Civil Rights Office in the U.S. Department of Education. Basically, picks whatever the media tells and then makes a government document. Then use that to drive money. You know, federal money now is basically putting into schools to bring kids back, and without rethinking about what innovations can do and could do. So that is, I think, the government piece we cannot. And policymakers, I'm sure, you know, we all kind of do some kind of consulting when they love your ideas. You know, when they don't, you know, they never ask you again. But when they ask you, they want one thing. You know, well, how does this work? You know, you have and also, you know, academia. People been trying to train us how to talk to politicians. I said, you know, I can't. You know, 3 minutes in the elevator ride, you know, they're going to listen to me. You know, they listen to their grandchildren. But I think I just want to add to what you were saying about the media. But I think policymakers have the same kind of challenge, and they want to address what parents want, and then they pick on what you think will be the best thing, you know. Punya.
No, I'm glad you brought out that What Works. This is a few years back. I haven't been to that site in a while. I went and looked up what in the What Works clearinghouse, which is supposed to be, you know, the best research and what do we know from it. And there was only one study on educational technology, which was about a piece of software which I'm not sure even exists anymore today, about reading and math, which was done across these, and they found some mixed results out of it. And at the same time, we have companies, organizations selling tools and technologies and learning management systems and proctoring systems and what have you, with no research behind it at all. And to me, that is not to me an argument for that we need more research, because there isn't going to be time to do that research. What we need is more thoughtful implementation by people who are in charge of those things, based on what we know now. And I think that the What Works clearinghouse, particularly in a tech space, is a complete, it's useless. It offers no insight to somebody who would be, let's say, a K-12 administrator, who would say, okay, now that a pandemic is happening, let me go and see what the US government, after spending so much money, has to tell us about what works in ed tech. There was nothing there for them, and that's after so much money being spent. And that doesn't mean that there aren't educators, that aren't people who are in that space, who have something to contribute to the conversation. But if the expectation is, like Chris is saying, and like Zhao, you're saying, that it's got to be this, if you take this tool and put it here, it's going to immediately lead to, joy and happiness and learning. That's just not going to happen. I mean, if one thing this whole silver lining has taught me, in all the multiple conversations that we have had, is that systems and culture will have technology for breakfast. That if you have in your organization the groups who have really been inspirational, and the conversation that we have, they understand the systems within which these work and try to take these technologies and make it work within that system or change that system. That's the only way that's going to be sustainable. It is never going to be driven by just one tool or one technology or one idea.
Thank you, Punya. I think we are really, today, I'm so happy we're talking about this. This is the idea about what works. Remember the reading panel under George Bush prescribed the best reading methods to improve reading. $6 billion. Under Margaret Spanier said, now we've developed medicine for cancer, for reading. It just scratch. I mean, it's a bunch of people splitting government money. Did nothing really. Yeah, they spent about like $10-15 million to do a study to see if it worked. Of course, it did not work. So the idea of trying to finding one innovation for all problems, or finding one innovation without any side effects or any side problems, it is a huge challenge. Here, actually, I'm going to invite you guys to think about this. I am co-editing, the review of research in education with Ron Beghetto. Our next issue is about side effects. It's about anything that works can hurt, can work against something. So this is really the interesting idea about when Chris talked about media, when I talk about the government, when we have our listeners, whatever, if you are an innovator, you cannot expect to solve the problem for all children and all the time and in all contexts. You cannot do that. If you are an administrator, when you select something, you cannot possibly do that. Kurt, I know you have something to say.
Two things. Both relate back to Chris's on the media, but first off, I'm going to link it in here with saying, if you're going to work on a project, no better place to be in ed tech, because there's a lot of great people in the world to work with. There's a lot of people you don't want to work with, but the nice thing about being in this field is there are a lot of people who want to make a difference, who want to make an impact. And clearly there are many we've all worked with brilliant people in our careers. And so any young person taking a master's in this field right now, or a doctorate, that you'll find a plethora of people that you can work with. I just point that out because it relates to my next point. The media, and Chris knows this very well, and Punya and Young know this too. They only call you when they need an answer, and they need it quick. And you have to do all this research and whatnot. And I have one shouldn't say colleague, he's not a colleague, one writer who calls me all the time on what's going on in the Arab region, the Gulf region, because I've read about it, I've been there and whatnot. And as soon as he gets his piece for the article, boom, he's gone. I have to track him down to find out if it's ever published or not. The writers the media are not your friends typically, and that that troubles me because I only want to work with people who are my friends. And so, you know, we, Chris, I'm sure, and Young and Punya do yeoman's work researching a topic for the media. And then, you know, you never get anything other, you know, you never even find out where it's published. But I want to bring back to the second point, something that Chris said, probably if you're a graduate student, some words of wisdom. He said 2 words. He said, it depends. Now, those are the best 2 words you can use in this field when you talk to media, when you talk to government officials and whatnot. I want to give a little story. In 2002, I was in New Zealand for the first time in Otago, at the University of Otago in Dunedin, in the South Island, giving talks. And I was asked to go up to Palmerston North on the North Island. So I flew into Wellington. People picked me up, took me to Palmerston North. And then I had to give some talks at the University of Waikato. And that's actually why I was there for a conference at Waikato. And Mr. Bean got me off the plane and said, can you be on television tomorrow? And the guy looked like Mr. Bean. It wasn't Mr. Bean. And I had to get up at like 6 a.m. after flying from the South Island to the North Island. And I was exhausted. I got up and got ready at the TV station, the remote station in Hamilton, New Zealand, remote from the main studio. And so they gave me 3 questions. Here's what we're going to ask you. And you had an hour to study them. So I'm sitting there for an hour and no one's coming into the studio. And finally, one person who was the pro vice chancellor comes in there. He had worked for Margaret Thatcher. He knew his stuff and what. So we're sitting down after an hour waiting. It's going to be on the next show. It's going to be on the next show. It's after the next commercial break. We're just waiting and waiting. Comes off the commercial break. What do they say? Here, Kurt, what's the state of e-learning? What's the state of e-learning? And I'm like, blah, 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 blah. On national television, my first time on national television, I look like a total fool. And they go to Ryan Smith, the pro vice chancellor, and he answers the next question fine. I answer the next question fine. I go back to the hotel where the conference is being held. A guy gets into my taxi. He looks at me. You were just on TV. And he's just laughing because he knew I just blew it, you know? And I go into the conference to give my invited talk, the 10 mini myths of e-learning, dressed up as Mickey Mouse, I think. And I give my talk, and Mr. Bean comes up, can you be on national radio? I said, sure, I can't screw up any more national television. And so he takes me to the back outside on a picnic table, and he says, and the guy gets on national radio, and he says, what's the state of e-learning? And by that time, I had an answer. It depends. And so the conference ends, and John Hedberg, whom some of you may know, John, and Julie Salmon, who we had on the show earlier a few months ago, and a couple others, they had the keynotes all line up. And they said, okay, all the keynotes are going to line up at the end of the conference, and they're going to tell us what the state of e-learning is. I mean, what the hell is the state of e-learning? But what happened was they just had The Lord of the Rings filmed in New Zealand, and they wanted to be the hub for media, for e-learning, for everything. And so they thought if they could answer that question, that one it. So my points within there is you never know what people are going to ask you. So always have that answer, it depends, because that comes in real handy from time to time. And you won't look like a total fool like I did. And I'm sure all of us have had that experience of that moment. You know, I was on WGN with all the papers I had studied sticking out of my suit coat pocket. You know, and on national, it was on national WGN. You know, it looked like a fool then too. I much prefer radio. I much prefer radio. So I'm sorry, Chris. I just had to pull that after the "it depends" comment. Do you have anything like that, Chris?
Well, Punya's going to bring up some things from Gerald, and then and then I've got a different point to make.
Sounds good. So Gerald has dropped a few comments here. I think 2 things stand out, and I'm going to sort of compress them because he's put a bunch. I think one that he speaks to is this idea of empowering our youth themselves as having agency, which I think has been a theme in a couple of our episodes in the recent past. So I think that's an important one. And if anybody wants to comment on that. But I think the other thing he says, which I think speaks to the broader systemic issue, where he says, the other challenge we have is that people in systems are hiding behind the pandemic and not talking about improving teaching and learning. And, you know, gives us a little shout out saying that, you know, there are exceptions to this, but they are rare. And so, you know, and this question of why kids are not coming back and so on. So I would love to hear from people, from any of you, any thoughts you have about this issue of sort of hiding behind the pandemic, using the pandemic for other reasons rather than asking about teaching and learning. What your thoughts are on that point.
Jared, I think those are very good points, but when you ask the question, for example, I love the question, are they asking why the kids are not returning in the first place? We talked about last week, 2 weeks ago, we got kids in Chicago, in Washington, D.C. protesting. They don't want to go back, actually. But again, I want to use the term called it depends. Not all children,
Exactly.
Not all children. Some children are flourishing online. They are not bullied. They are happy. They are doing their own thing. They got the autonomy, got freedom. Some children want to go to school, hang out with their friends. So I think, to paraphrase Chris, it depends. It depends is not a slippery road. It actually, I think, from the science of improvement, keeps talking about, we won't ask the question, under what conditions, what works for whom and for what purpose. I think those is a lot better questions than does it work. So I think I just want to add that. And the idea right now, schools, we gotta acknowledge schools are in an authoritarian system that tries to become the thing for every student, and which does not work that way. Chris?
So I want to plug a future episode, March 26th. Barbara Means and Jeremy Rochelle from Digital Promise will be coming in. And one of the reasons that we're inviting them is that they're both very thoughtful about research and about epistemology. And in fact, Barbara led, and I was one of many, many people who participated in a report that the U.S. Department of Education funded in 2013 called Evidence of Effectiveness. And it is the best report on research that I've seen, because it basically says there's different stages of evidence as technologies or any other kind of intervention evolves. And so here's the kind of study that you can do at this particular stage. And here's the kind of evidence that you can get out of that. And then you can use that evidence to decide whether to go on to the next stage or not. Because the alternative, and this is what underlies the What Works Clearinghouse, and frankly, it underlies many of my colleagues at Harvard who would argue vehemently with me if they were here, is the idea that you leap immediately to some kind of randomized clinical trial. And that's the only measure of whether something works or not. And of course, what we find, and the What Works Clearinghouse is a perfect example of this, is that it's impossible under real world circumstances to do a random clinical trial that will succeed. And so nothing works when you expose it to a randomized clinical trial. And in fact, education is not medicine. If you want to test an antibiotic, sure, because an antibiotic doesn't care what your ethnicity is, what your SES is, what your culture is. None of those things matter. If you have a body, then you can test the antibiotic. But in education, everything that we do it depends, because it's all shaped by contextual factors. And so, RCTs are the last thing that we should be doing. One of the things that I think is interesting about our program is that we don't ask people to submit to us proof that their model works. We don't say, well, show us your 0.95 level of significance for the intervention so we can judge whether it's worthy of being on Silver Lining for Learning. We're like Barbara Means and what Yang said. What works when, for who, under what circumstances? The good news about Silver Lining for Learning is that if you find something that works for somebody under some circumstances, at least you've got something to build on, as opposed to this idea that No, if you look at doctoral dissertations, boy, I'm going to disillusion a lot of the audience, I'm afraid. If you look at doctoral dissertations, most of the time you get no significant results, unless it's just really a Mickey Mouse dissertation. Sorry about the technical language here. And the reason is that there's not enough time for the treatment to possibly work, right? Because it takes time and money to really implement something that has a chance of working in education. So the dissertation concludes no significant difference, but it's because you only took the antibiotics for one day and then you said, well, wait a minute, I'm not feeling better, and I'll just throw out the rest of the bottle and try something else. So it's, the epistemology that we espouse is not respected within the scholarly community. And yet, in fact, it's where we need to go if we're going to transform education in any significant way.
Just to add to that, Chris, educational journals, like medical journals, like psychology journals, always favor significant. And actually, there's a call right now for dropping, testing the p-value or those kind of things. Is that it's a lot of times, even though we look at it like effect size of 0.5, sounds big, but then you at least get maybe 1/3 of the students who got hurt. As long as you got, like I always joke about, that's why vaccination is interesting. You said, okay, I've saved 5 people, but killed 5. Does it work? So it's that. This is very complicated. But I want to just add to that. Journals often favor certain type of things, and they favor methodological value less than the question. The question may be a lot more important. So I'm so happy you kind of talking about Barbara Means and Jeremy Rochelle's kind of work and in that episode, and also about how we select people in silver lining for learning. We're really trying to look at some outcomes, but also we are also encouraging the innovative spirit, which is missing tremendously in the schools right now that are eager to return. So I want to really highlight one point from Fernando last week, really about how very authoritarian systems, when they drop, when the system collapses, you have more innovations. I have seen educational systems that are very authoritarian. When they collapse, truly there are a lot more innovations. But as soon as they can get back, they kill them very quickly. They kill those things very quickly. So I was wondering, Punya, if you can comment on, will those nonprofits survive in India, or can they be part of the educational system, for example?
So before I jump into that, Zhao, I wanted to make another point, and this is sort of building on the bigger point that Chris was making. So there's a group in India called the Azim Premji Foundation, and the person who heads that, they work with some of the most impoverished districts. And once I had him on a panel at AERA, the Anurag Bihar, and one of the questions that was asked, we had people from different foundations over there, and the question that was asked is like, how do you use data in taking your, doing your decision making? And in fact, they had funded some of the largest RCTs and then decided that was not a way they were going to go because it was not informing them in any significant way. But what he said to me goes back, Chris, to the point you made, that when we get guests on the show, we are not asking them for p-values or effect sizes. And what he said is that data, which has stayed with me forever, it's like data is a function of distance. The further away you are from the phenomena, the more you're going to depend on abstracted data. So he says the biggest part of my job is going and looking at actual classrooms, talking to teachers, talking to students, talking to community leaders. And so he is on the move perpetually, because then he can see how the needle is moving and what is working for whom under what circumstance. But if he would sit in Bangalore in his office and say, I need aggregate data on student scores, he would never be able to see those movements that are happening in individual classrooms and spaces. So I think that quote, that the need for data is a function of distance from the phenomena, I think is a really powerful one. Because if you think about it, like when you're a parent, you're seeing your child and then you see the report card, you know the richness of that child, and you see that that's not being captured in that aggregate data for that kid or for the school or for the, so on, right? So I think that's a really powerful thing. And Zhao, coming back to your question about whether I think that some of these will sustain, I think because Indian educational system is under so much stress and strain because of sort of the economics and so on, that I think that it sort of exists in a world where 1,000 flowers can bloom. So these will continue in their own ways because there is just so much diversity in that space. So yes, you have the government education system, but you have a whole private school system. You have, all kinds of things working in sort of parallel, sometimes in synchrony, usually in complete chaos with each other. So I think that actually allows for some of these innovations to continue and grow. So I think, yes, I would say in some ways, yes, because of the disruptive nature of the space itself, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic,
So I have one final point I want to make. So if you guys can respond, because right now in the US, from all the schools I've visited, I've observed, I've talked to over this, all the innovations are forced to have, and many schools have actually bought products from companies for online learning content, online learning platform. So a lot of these innovations, I wouldn't, they are innovations because they're new, but they're not necessarily high quality innovations. I have not yet seen many schools use this opportunity to drive a conversation about this. Like Jared was asking, why don't we ask the students? Why don't we ask the teachers? Why don't we invent something? This is the US, I'm talking about US education systems as far as I know. So I was wondering, can we imagine some possibilities to say, can we stop for 2 weeks to have a conversation about new possibilities? And then before we can start, that conversation can involve parents, students, we can do Zoom, we can do something. Just really, can we reimagine the possibility other than just to resume to the past? Anyone wants to jump in with that, or you guys can ignore that? That's just something bothers me,
Well, I think that some of it is about stance, the stance that you come in with when you're looking to innovate. So from 1999 to 2009, I and colleagues on the River City project developed a curriculum, implemented it in a whole bunch of schools, and talked with teachers and conducted standard studies of effectiveness and more innovative studies of effectiveness. And one of the best indicators, I thought, that we used for effectiveness, which was we said to teachers, which students did really well in River City, and you were completely surprised by that. And they would talk about their D students and their F students who were completely disengaged or who just didn't learn well under the teaching by telling and learning by doing method, and how they came alive and got really engaged and really succeeded, and all of a sudden showed all this trapped intelligence. Now, of course, if we can also ask a different question. We can say, which of your students who did really well under the lecture method struggled in River City? And of course, there were a bunch, because they kept saying, is this going to be on the test, right? What should I do next? You haven't told me what I have to do next. And so the point is not that this was a silver bullet, but the point is that it reached students that were failing under the conventional system. And it seems to me that the same thing is happening now. Instead of saying which students who were being bullied in school, who couldn't learn under teaching by telling, who weren't really given a chance in the educational system, thrived under remote learning. And then how do we keep them thriving, and at the same time, scale and help students who learn in a different way and so on. So it's always looking for the failures, and there are always going to be failures. There is no one right way to learn. Instead of looking for the successes and saying, wow, here's a student in 8th grade that everybody thought was an idiot, and all of a sudden they're at the front of the class because we're teaching them in a different way.
Sorry, Gerald
Thank you, Chris. Pune, go ahead.
Yeah, Gerald has a comment there where I think those of us on SLL should, recognize that Zhao, to your question about why aren't we asking these questions, it speaks to the fact that those were the questions that were indeed asked in their community and in their schools, and that there is a blog post about how they address that and use that to design. So I just wanted to make sure that was mentioned in our conversation here.
So
I agree with Chris on the success notion, and in a couple of episodes with teachers from Taiwan, from Finland, from Mexico, from New Zealand, we'll be talking about their successes. With my Transformative Teaching Around the World book, it's out as an ebook. It's out in paper soon, and we'll bring in some of the authors in two episodes. So I agree with Chris, and we'll be featuring some teachers in what they've been doing in their respective environments.
So we're going to have a bunch of episodes to deal with some significant issues which we never had. I just want to use the opportunity to put it and add more. We're going to have 2 deans of schools of education, because we kept talking about teacher preparation, teacher re-preparation. So what can they do? So we're going to have the dean from the Arizona State University, kind of Punya's boss, and my boss from the University of Kansas. We're going to have 2 deans, our bosses, come in to talk about at least, what they're doing. My dean has been there for over 20 years. He's been part of the dean network. So that we interact with them. And we're also organizing, part of a global education deans network. We have one, and we've been having that for 3 years. So we're talking a lot about how institutionally, what can they do? What should they do? What are they thinking about doing about teacher education? I think that's another very significant thing that we're dealing with. A week after that, we're also going to have 2 superintendents, one from Canada, one from the US, suburban schools, well-to-do schools, to come in to talk about what they've been doing, what they're trying to do. And both of the superintendents are well networked with others. And we're still working on some superintendents from inner city schools or rural areas, which have difficulty, disadvantaged areas, to come to talk about that. We're still looking for people like that. If you know anyone, you can welcome to suggest to us. So we're planning to tackle some systematic challenges and to understand the context, which Punya is talking about, which is also, like Chris, I love what you said, race, gender, age, home income, all those things are factors, those things. So I think this is, we're going to have some really exciting shows in the next couple of months. Chris, you want to talk about the next episode?
Sure. So looking down the road, to continue what Yang was saying, I mentioned that at the end of March, we'll have Jeremy Vichel and Barbara Means in. There's 4 of us at the Harvard Graduate School of Education that think a lot about scale. Fernando was here in the last episode. In April, my colleagues Monica Higgins and Jim Honan will be here to talk about scale with me. So we'll have all 4 of us in one form or another to get us thinking about scale. But I'm very excited about next week's episode, which is about Palestine and the tremendous challenges of learning there during the pandemic, remote learning, and really the heroic efforts of teachers and government and policymakers and leaders to keep the education going under those circumstances. So I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. I hope that you'll join us for that.